Hi, I'm Daniel Pasciuti. I'm an assistant professor of sociology. Housing issues for sociology are both cause and consequence of a myriad of issues and related to questions around debates around economics, philosophy, healthcare, industry, and a variety of other disciplines. These have always been complex interdisciplinary questions. It goes back at least 150 years to debates over how to address questions, housing conditions, and shortages in Europe during the Industrial Revolution. There were very famous philosophical debates between Proudhon and Frederick Engels. At both a local and macro level, I see housing as something that is interminably connected to questions of governance and how issues are or are not addressed in a cohesive approach. So this rise of new forms of financial capitalism, explosions of municipal debt in the past decades has led to both changes in housing options, such as the elimination of public housing in the United States, and the rise of large-scale corporate landlords and management companies, which have altered the power balance between the state, local officials, landlords, and renters. Combined with questions of environmental sustainability, shifts in geographic centers of economic growth and political power, the need and ability to address questions of housing in an interdisciplinary manner is definitely increasing. This ranges from philosophical and potentially legal questions about housing as a human right and implications for seeing housing as something that is intrinsic to life, or seeing it as an economic commodity or an investment tool in urban growth and development. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN in 1948. Includes the right to adequate housing. This was actually originally put forward by Franklin Roosevelt as the President of the United States in 1944. But by and large, we have retained our ideas of housing as commodity in this country, which is often direct contradiction to thinking of housing as something that is a human right. I'm working on several housing-related projects. There's projects on courts and housing and the role and process of eviction courts. This plays out in the fact that in Georgia, there are 159 counties, and there's a prevailing joke that there are 159 different ways of dealing with housing eviction. And that's because while there is one law in the state of Georgia that governs questions of housing and eviction, that law is vague in terms of the exact policies and practices that need to be put in place. And while in many types of court cases, murder is an example, there have been lots of precedent of laws. That doesn't happen in civil law, in housing law. And so there's a lot of gray area in this process. And what that means is that courts interpret that policy and that practice very differently. And that can play out in terms of the form that you're using to respond to a summons. It can mean that the summons can be somewhat different itself. Who is bringing that summons to a renter or who is performing the eviction is different. Sometimes that can be a sheriff's officer, sometimes that can be a constable. And why that matters is that a sheriff's officer is a sheriff. They're their own separate law enforcement agency. They may work with the court, but they do not actually respond or serve the court in that sense. Whereas a constable works directly for the court. If there is an issue with a case, if there is a question that comes up, will take that directly to the chief magistrate of the court because that's who they work for. And those questions of governance and how this plays out have huge impacts on the variation of what it means. And what it means in that particular context is that what's happening in a court in one county can be very different than what happens to you in an eviction case in a court in another county, even if they're only a couple miles apart. Other projects that we've taken on in this way is in Clayton County. We have what's called the Homeless Intervention Prevention Program. And that's working with local government, magistrate court, and local nonprofits, seeking to create interventions in housing insecurity and related issues. So we work directly with government and non-governmental agencies to understand and reduce housing security in the area. This all involves understanding the relationship between housing insecurity, transportation, education, health, and food. We have another project we've recently begun in Rockdale County that's trying to address the issue of housing and poverty with local nonprofits there as well. And these all relate to issues that these counties are in the path of what we call the suburbanization of poverty. They have long-standing historical issues of housing insecurity and poverty themselves that's now being compounded by the gentrification in Atlanta that is pushing people out of Atlanta and into these farther and farther suburban spaces that creates new pressures and processes in these ways. And so these things play out in what we call the suburbanization of poverty. So the Rockdale County and Clayton County projects work in areas of Metro Atlanta that are experiencing profound demographic and sociological changes. They have historic issues of poverty and lack resources in area outside of Atlanta City proper, combined with new pressures from the gentrification of the city of Atlanta that we've been experiencing over the last several decades. And this has forced people further and further from what we consider the traditional urban core. And what that plays out as is a few years ago, there was some work done that estimated that social service agencies in Atlanta receive about $65 for every $1.73 that agencies in the suburbs receive. This creates a massive disparity in both the presence of local service agencies, local non-governmental organizations in the larger metro area, and the ability of the agencies that exist there to actually offer comprehensive and sustainable services. When you combine this with what we call the retreat of the state, so in sociology, we refer to the pullback of direct government support agencies and funding. This creates unique areas of the metro area where there is a severe mismatch between the need and capacity to address housing and associated issues. One way to sort of understand this is the ability to access legal help. In the 5 core counties of Atlanta, there is Atlanta Legal Aid, as well as other organizations like Atlanta Volunteers Lawyers Foundation. These provide free or reduced legal support for persons, and that includes questions of housing and eviction. Outside of those 4 counties, there is only one organization in the state of Georgia that offers that service, the Georgia Legal Services Providers, who often have one attorney for every 3 to 4 counties. So one attorney travels between these several counties that they're responsible for, and they may be in the first county on Monday, the second county on Tuesday, the third county on Wednesday, as an example. This means that when you need help for any legal service, but in particular in the context of housing, which is a very fast process. In the state of Georgia, this can be as short as 1 to 2 weeks in the turnaround between the summons, the going to the court, and actually having to respond. Your ability to catch that attorney on a particular day, have them help you address that, is very limited. And they try really hard, but they just aren't there. The resources aren't there that you can walk down to any place and get legal assistance because you need it. Because it literally just does not exist in some of these spaces. So these issues affect our students in a myriad of ways around transportation, obviously housing itself, food, work, these sorts of issues. So one is our ability of our students to live near campus or live in Atlanta. And we already see this issue that we have students that are commuting from long distances in the suburbs and even exurbs within Atlanta coming to campus. That creates questions of their own ability to maintain their housing, to maintain their work schedules while they're also taking classes and getting their degrees. It becomes a transportation issue. Atlanta doesn't exactly have the most robust public transportation system, so you're relying on public transportation, basically a car, and cars become incredibly important. And if the car breaks down, you have the repairs, you have an inability to go places, and again, these affects these dynamics. How you're getting your food. If you're traveling long distances, you're probably doing things like stopping for fast food. You're not really necessarily having the time to go to grocery stores, build nutritious full meals, these sorts of things. You're not getting exercise by walking in a classic urban core between classes, between your home, these sorts of things. You're spending more time in cars. All these things impact our students. They impact the amount of time they have to actually devote towards learning, the amount of other external sociological pressures that they are under, both from work and life balances. And all of these things impact our ability to create an educational system where you are given the opportunity to become the best you can, because you have all these external pressures that sometimes aren't faced at a lot of other universities. It is both the sort of, it's the great thing of being an urban university, which is what Georgia State is, but it's also somewhat of a curse because we are forced to address these problems in ways that classical land-grant universities would not have to deal with. So I would strongly advocate for students and people to advocate and get involved with local organizations. This has happened in the past in the U.S. There are actually a myriad of examples in history of how people have engaged these questions and brought attention to them. Local leaders and even state and federal agencies will respond if there's a loud enough voice and concern around the issue. An example I can give you is there's a famous example in housing called the Baltimore Plan, which came out in the 1950s. And That was local people getting involved and really addressing the question of, at the time, what they considered slums, which were really dilapidated, poor housing conditions, and how that was affecting the rest of the city. And it brought together, they were able to make the concern understood, both from the standpoint of health, from the standpoint of education, but also in the standpoint of economics, and getting local leaders to understand that the problems of the housing stock were actually creating issues for Baltimore itself. And this led to comprehensive response. Now, there were lots of problems with that, and as we know, with all sorts of policies and processes and these sorts of things, our ability to understand this and address it, at any given time is limited in these ways, but it can be done, and it can be done in a very systematic level if people want it to happen. And that's what happens, right? Local leaders and agencies are only going to respond, unfortunately, to the loudest squeaky wheel. So if you advocate and you get involved, you can make that squeaky wheel work. So this was most recently on display during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the question of housing and health was brought to the forefront of trying to address the spread of disease. So the imposition of eviction moratoria that prevented people from being removed from their homes due to non-payment of rent or mortgage was the explicit acknowledgement by the Centers for Disease Control and other health agencies and organizations in the federal government that housing was essential to individual and overall public health. But it immediately ran into legal and economic challenges about the sustainability of such a position in the United States. So mortgages, as an example, were allowed to be extended. Missed payments were added on to future years, but that also then immediately raises questions about the interest on those loans and the duration of how far you could push that into the future and what that looked like for people's abilities to plan going forward to pay off their loans. Rents were left accruing without a clear understanding how that would play out. Is that going to be forgiven? Is it going to be reallocated into some form of payment plan that you are going to pay to your landlord in the future? Or is it going to become a lump sum payment required as soon as the moratorium ended? Which was a real serious question that people were trying to address, because if that was the case, then there was a lot of claims that this would lead to what was called an eviction cliff at the end of the moratorium, because people were going to owe thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, that they would not have immediately available to pay. So eviction assistance programs sought to solve these issues with federal support. But then you run into questions of eligibility, of residency, even habitability becomes salient in these questions. If you live in a place, but you're not on the lease or mortgage, are you a resident? If it's the place where you sleep at night, that would say this is your home. But when it comes to a legal question in these dynamics, the question of whether or not you're on the lease or on the mortgage says whether or not you actually have legal title to be that resident. And this goes back to the question of whether housing is a human right or whether it's an economic commodity. And that is always a contradiction we are dealing with in these questions. In Georgia, this led to a patchwork response to the question of housing and health during the pandemic. First was the question of whether the state would enforce something like an eviction ban that was mostly left to the decisions of local officials, with the clarity and guidance from federal or state authorities. Then there was the question of who would make these decisions and enforce them. Sometimes this was left to the courts, and sometimes it was left to law enforcement. All of this variation is done without a clear understanding of the multidimensional impacts that this would have on people and households. It's an example of why we need an interdisciplinary understanding of housing to consider the impact of COVID-19, both the history of what we've just been through, right? But also to think about the future of another housing crisis, because there will be another one coming. It may or may not be health related, but it will impact housing, and it will reverberate into many other interrelated issues that we have to address.